Senator McDonald.
Thank you. And I have to begin my comments regarding the Northern Territory Safe Measures Bill 2023 by reflecting on the huge body of work that's been done by my colleague, Senator Nampijinpa Price. The work that she has done in consulting broadly and deeply within the Northern Territory community is a perfect example of what it is to be a member of this place, to take the responsibilities and actions of being in government. And as outlined by Senator Price, she has taken a huge amount of time to consult with a range of different people, with her colleagues, and of course has been forced to take action on this matter by the lack of action by the Albanese government. Because when a government's action or inaction results in harm, then it is a moral imperative to stop that harm. There is no moral high ground by demonising and then rejecting alcohol restrictions in the Northern Territory, and it was the height of misplaced paternalistic inaction. Furthermore, defending this harmful stance in the face of extraordinary and alarming evidence was beyond the pale and had to be rectified. Now, it was in July of last year that we had a sunset on the previous legislation. And so after 3 months of being in government, with all the incoming ministerial briefs and others that would have been provided to the incoming government, when that legislation lapsed, somehow this lack of action became the problem for the coalition. And yet it was clearly understood by the community that action needed to be taken. This bill would allow for greater federal oversight of bans in the Northern Territory. It would have been similar to the powers granted to the Commonwealth by those expired intervention laws. And the Northern Territory government, with federal funding, has recently again prohibited takeaway alcohol in town camps, but more importantly, across the entire community, because this is not this legislation is designed to go across all vulnerable communities. Anyone who is subject to harm from additional alcohol in the community. So new restrictions on the sale of alcohol came into effect at the end of January, following a flying visit from the FIFO Prime Minister to the town. Takeaway alcohol-free days were introduced on Monday and Tuesday. Bottle shops were restricted to 3 p.m. And to 7 p.m. on other days, and a limit of 1 transaction per person per day was implemented. Now, this took months. This took months to be enacted by, finally, the Territory government after complete inaction by the federal government, because there had been a massive spike in home invasions, in robberies, in domestic violence and assaults, and which many people have clearly attributed to the end of the alcohol restrictions in July. Now, we know that this was a direct correlation because of the new data that has come out following the introduction of those new measures from the Territory government. It is reported in the Daily Telegraph that youth disturbances declined by 36.36% in February compared to January. The 235 unlawful entries across Alice Springs between January 2 and January 30, which dropped 45.96% to 127 incidents in the following month. Alcohol as a factor in domestic violence was down 27.7% over the month. And in the first week of January, when crime was at a crisis level, alcohol was deemed a factor in 76% of the 167 domestic violence incidents. By the week 20th of February, alcohol had decreased to being a factor in 47% of the 92 domestic violence incidents. This is a clear correlation between the lifting of alcohol restrictions and then the reintroduction of those restrictions in January after crime spiralled out of control. What is not reported in that data is the number of affected other family members, older children being forced to care for younger siblings, young people being forced out on the streets because of alcohol abuse at home. Care is often at the expense of the young people's own studies or jobs, and a cycle continues. This is repeated right across Northern Australia, and it destroys lives and futures. And Northern Territory lives are all of our responsibility, as is the need for kids, particularly going to school, being able to sleep soundly at night with full tummies and no fear of violence and abuse. We know that Alice Springs businesses had been impacted. People were afraid to go out at night. Children roaming the streets, and the police couldn't keep up. And we see similar effects in Katherine, in Tennant Creek, where in Western Australia, where people have been displaced from remote communities because of flooding, have ended up in town. And unless there are alcohol restrictions in those places, alcohol-related crime soars there too. We see the same issues in Mount Isa. Alcohol abuse is the enemy of advancement for vulnerable people, and restricting access is a circuit breaker to multi-generational dysfunction where violence, abuse and hopelessness are all that those people have to see each day. We have had significant research and studies of alcohol management plans, like the study of the Cape York alcohol management plan conducted in 2018. And that saw a greater reduction in violence against women in the community that entered prohibition compared with the communities that did not. A decrease in assault injury presentations, especially those linked with alcohol. A decrease in female victims of a police charge of violence against the person, and a perceived reduction in violence against women reported by community members. Now, there is a moral imperative at play that overrides political philosophy, something that Labor shamefully ignored when allowing these laws to lapse and then taking no action. Instead, it being left to those local communities to demand change. And again, Senator Nampijinpa Price and her colleagues, her Labor colleagues in the Northern Territory, were only too aware of the devastating impacts that the lifting of restrictions on alcohol was having in those communities. The Prime Minister promised to be a Prime Minister of action, and he has been on lots of planes overseas. He spent 4 hours in Alice Springs and couldn't get out fast enough. He was carefully shown the clean and tidy streets, but he didn't listen to those community members who were desperate for protection. Why is it that this must be the most important thing that a government can do, is protect its people, protect the most vulnerable in our communities? I don't know that there is any other task we have that is more important, whether it's economically, whether it's border protection, but in this very clear case, the restriction of alcohol to protect harm to vulnerable people could not have been more urgent, and yet we watched as the harm in those communities continued, whether it be crime against individuals and assaults, domestic violence, whether it be attacks on businesses, but the ones that really keep me awake at night are those children and vulnerable women who were left unprotected. I think that it was extraordinary to see that we are left waiting for a private senator's bill like this one to be able to provide the tools to extend a policy that was in place, that was working well. And of course now we have documented evidence of the impact of the lifting of alcohol restrictions and the impact that it's had on people's lives, on people's property and on their future. I reflect on the many people who were left without protection, and I encourage this federal government to once again turn its mind to supporting this legislation, because these are issues that are seen not just in the Northern Territory. This is a Northern Australia issue. Alcohol abuse is something that we struggle with in so many communities. I've touched on Catherine, but outside of the Northern Territory, in Mount Isa, in my own communities, where we see people coming across the border, coming to places that don't have alcohol restrictions, and the subsequent impact that that's having on those communities, but worse, on those people who are vulnerable to alcohol. It is a terrible scourge, and we have rules around other prohibited drugs. We have rules around putting safety notices on food, depending on its health level. We try to alert people to impacts on them from imbibing something which is going to be bad. But for alcohol, we don't have that sort of restrictions and alerts. I think that this is a terrible oversight from all levels of government, but to have seen it in Alice Springs, to have seen the impact of the lifting of restrictions immediately, to have seen the damage and the terror from people living in those communities, I think that this was a shocking, wasted months of inaction from this government. We saw in December that they were happy to walk into the Parliament and introduce legislation for what they saw as an urgent need to intervene in the gas and the coal markets. They did that with very little notice, and we saw the legislation only hours before we came into this place to debate it. But they have not been willing to take the same sort of urgent intervention when there are children as young as 5 were walking around on the streets unprotected because they were not safe at home, when we saw a spike in assaults and crimes, when we saw young people who should have been preparing for school the next day unable to be safe in their own homes, when we saw elderly people being assaulted. This is and was a national emergency, and yet this government did nothing. And it wasn't because they didn't know. They were alerted to this by Senator Nampijinpa Price. They would have heard the same things from the members of Parliament from the Northern Territory, as well as the other senator from the Northern Territory. This is a shocking indictment on what the Albanese government talks about as the necessary requirement for a voice, and yet they do not listen to voices in regional Australia and on the ground. I commend this legislation. I think that it was incredibly brave and well researched and thought through, and I think that the efforts of individual senators and members to recognise urgent and important issues in their community is something that we must never lose sight of. The more that we are a long way away in Canberra and not remembering the impact of legislation or the sunsetting of legislation in places like the Northern Territory, then we have failed. We have failed the people who rely on us to protect and preserve their way of life. And I think that it has been a shocking missed opportunity from this government to have done absolutely nothing. So I'm very proud of this private senator's bill from Senator Nampijinpa Price. I support it in every way, and I hope that the government will consider supporting it to provide them with some tools to continue the protection and oversight of communities for the most vulnerable people who have been affected by alcohol violence, by alcohol abuse, and I commend this legislation to this place. Thank you.
Thank you.